You're replaceable. 2 words. That was the exact sentence Diane Prescott used at 2:30 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon inside the glass boardroom on the 14th floor of Meridian Freight Partners. I remember the time because I had been watching the clock behind her head, counting how many minutes were left before the quarterly review would finally end. I remember the glass because everyone on the operations floor could see straight into that room. And I remember the silence because it was the kind of silence that only happens when 9 people simultaneously decide not to look at the person who just had their career publicly cut open. Diane didn't even lower her voice. She said it the same way she would have asked someone to close a window. Flat, casual, almost bored. Frankly, Marcus, the operations side of this business isn't complicated enough to justify what we're paying you. You're replaceable, and I think it's time the leadership team acknowledges that. Then she moved on to the next slide. My name is Marcus Halloran, 51 years old, Vice President of Operations at Meridian Freight Partners, and until that Wednesday afternoon, I had spent 11 years of my life running the operational backbone of a company that handled cross-border freight coordination for some of the largest industrial clients in the Midwest. 11 years of night calls. 11 years of Christmas mornings interrupted by port shutdowns. 11 years of quietly rebuilding logistics chains that other people took credit for during investor calls. And in one afternoon in front of the entire executive team, the CFO reduced all of it to a throwaway line between 2 PowerPoint slides. I didn't respond. That's the part people always ask me about later. Why I didn't say anything. Why I didn't defend myself. Why I didn't push back the way most people would have. The truth is simpler than any explanation I could give afterward. When you've spent your whole career watching corporate meetings, you learn to recognize the exact moment when the outcome has already been decided somewhere else. Diane wasn't testing me. She wasn't opening a discussion. She was announcing a conclusion that had been reached in a room I was never invited to. So I sat there. I kept my hands folded on top of my notebook. I looked at her once when she said the word replaceable, then I looked back down at my notes. I finished the meeting the way I always did. I answered 2 technical questions from the CEO about warehouse throughput. I nodded when someone from finance mentioned Q3 projections. I closed my notebook when the meeting ended, and I walked out of the glass boardroom without saying a single word to anyone. That night, I drove home slower than usual. My wife Corinne was already asleep by the time I got in. I sat at the kitchen table for almost 2 hours in the dark, drinking water from a glass I never refilled, thinking about the exact sequence of events that had brought me to that moment. I thought about the CEO, Warren Blackwell, who had watched Diane say those words and had not corrected her. I thought about our biggest client, Halston Krager Industrial, and the ongoing renewal negotiation that only 3 people in the entire company fully understood. I thought about the offer letter I had turned down 4 months earlier from a competitor because I still believed loyalty meant something. By 2 in the morning, I had made my decision. I opened my laptop, drafted my resignation letter in 1 clean paragraph, and scheduled it to send at exactly 8:00 a.m. the following morning. Then I closed the computer, went upstairs, and slept better than I had in 3 years. I didn't know it yet, but 6 days later, everything Diane Prescott had built her career on would begin to unravel 1 client meeting at a time. Thursday morning arrived cold and gray, the kind of overcast Midwest sky that made everything outside the kitchen window look drained of color. I woke up at 5:47 a.m., which was earlier than usual, and I remember lying in bed for a few minutes just listening to the house, the heater clicking on in the basement, the soft hum of the refrigerator downstairs, Corinne breathing beside me, small ordinary sounds that suddenly felt important because I knew I was about to change something that couldn't be undone. At 7:15, I got dressed the same way I always did. Dark gray suit, white shirt, no tie because Meridian had gone business casual 4 years earlier. I made coffee. I ate a slice of toast standing at the counter. Karen came downstairs around 7:40 and asked me if I wanted eggs, and I told her no thank you, I wasn't hungry. She looked at me for a second longer than usual, the way spouses do when they can sense something is different but can't quite name it. She didn't ask. I didn't explain. I kissed her on the forehead and left for the office. The resignation email sent automatically at 8:00 a.m. while I was still in the parking garage. By the time I reached the elevator on the ground floor, my phone was already buzzing in my jacket pocket. I didn't look at it. I walked into the lobby, badged through the turnstile, and took the elevator to the 12th floor where my office sat at the end of the operations wing. I didn't turn on my computer. I didn't sit down. I placed my badge, my company laptop, and my corporate credit card in a neat row on the center of my desk. Then I sat in the leather chair by the window and waited. Warren Blackwell arrived first. He was the CEO, 63 years old, silver hair, expensive glasses, the kind of executive who spoke slowly to give himself time to calculate. He knocked on my door frame even though the door was open. "Marcus," he said carefully, "we need to talk about this email." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. He didn't sit down. "I understand you're upset," he began, "but this kind of reaction isn't like you." I let him finish before I answered. "Warren," I said quietly, "Diane called me replaceable in front of the entire executive team yesterday. You were sitting 3 seats away from me and you didn't say one word. That tells me exactly how much my 11 years here are worth to this leadership team. I'm not upset. I'm clarified." He tried to recover. He used phrases like heat of the moment and misunderstood context and let's talk about a path forward. I let him talk. I didn't interrupt him once. When he finally ran out of prepared language, I told him the same thing I would repeat to 3 other executives over the next 2 hours. My resignation is effective immediately. I will not be available for a transition period. I wish the company well. By 10:30 a.m., Diane herself finally came to my office. She didn't knock. She walked in with that specific type of executive composure that CFOs practice for hostile board meetings. Calm face, folded arms, controlled voice. "Marcus," she said, "I think you're overreacting to a comment that was taken out of context." I looked at her for a long moment before I answered. "Diane," I said, "there is no context in which the word replaceable is taken out of context." She didn't respond to that. She stood there for maybe another 5 seconds, then she turned around and walked out. I was gone by noon. No goodbye party, no farewell email. Just a cardboard box, my badge left on the desk, and an 11-year career quietly closed like a laptop lid. The first phone call from Halston Krager came the next morning. Friday morning, 9:14 a.m., I was standing in my kitchen refilling a coffee pot when my personal cell phone rang. The number wasn't saved, but I recognized the area code immediately. Cleveland, Ohio. Halston Krager Industrial's corporate headquarters. I set the coffee pot down slowly and answered. The voice on the other end belonged to Elena Voss, Senior Vice President of Supply Chain at Halston Krager. I had worked with Elena for close to 9 years, ever since Meridian had first won the Halston Krager contract back when I was still a director. She was one of those rare senior executives who actually understood the operational side of what she managed. She read the reports. She asked the hard questions. She remembered names of warehouse floor supervisors in cities she had never visited. In an industry full of executives who treated logistics like a spreadsheet, Elena was the exception. "Marcus," she said without any of the usual pleasantries, "I just got off a call with Warren Blackwell. He told me you left the company yesterday. I want to hear it from you directly. Is that true?" I told her it was. There was a long pause on the other end, not a confused pause. The kind of pause someone takes when they are quickly recalculating an entire strategic decision in real time. Elena was not a person who reacted emotionally. She processed. Then she spoke carefully. "I need to understand what happened," she said. "Not the corporate version. The real version." I chose my words carefully. I wasn't going to badmouth Meridian. That wasn't my style and it wasn't going to help anyone. But I also wasn't going to lie to a woman I had trusted operationally for 9 years. I told her the truth in the fewest words possible. There was a leadership disagreement about my role and the future direction of the operations function. I made the decision that leaving was the right outcome for me personally. I did not go into the specifics of what Diane had said. I did not need to. Eleanor had sat in enough executive meetings to fill in the blanks herself. She listened without interrupting. Then she asked me one question, Marcus, who is going to manage our account. I stayed quiet for a moment before I answered. Eleanor, I said, I don't know. That decision hadn't been made when I left yesterday. She thanked me for being honest and told me she would be in touch. The call ended in under 7 minutes. I set the phone down on the counter and I stood there in my kitchen for a long time. I understood exactly what had just happened, even if the people back at Meridian did not. The Halston-Krager contract was up for renewal in 10 weeks. It represented approximately 34% of Meridian's annual revenue. And for the past 3 years, the entire operational relationship had been built around specific process architecture that I had personally designed after 2 near-catastrophic shipping delays in 2022. Those systems weren't documented anywhere in a way that a replacement could pick up quickly, not because I hid them, because leadership had rejected 3 separate budget requests to fund proper documentation infrastructure. Diane had signed off on every one of those rejections personally. Warren Blackwell called me twice that afternoon. I let both calls go to voicemail. He left one message asking me to call him back at my earliest convenience. His voice sounded thinner than it had the day before. By Friday evening, Corinne and I had dinner on the back porch. It was cool but not cold, and the neighborhood was quiet in that late October way where everyone stays inside after sunset. She asked me how I was feeling. I told her I felt calm. She asked me if I was worried about money. I told her we were fine for at least 18 months even without a paycheck. She asked me one more question, quieter than the others. Do you think they'll survive this? I looked at her and I told her the truth. I said, I honestly don't know. Saturday was quiet. Sunday was quieter. I spent most of the weekend doing things I hadn't done in years. I raked the leaves in the front yard. I fixed the loose hinge on the garage door that had been bothering Corinne for 4 months. I drove out to a hardware store 2 towns over just because I felt like taking the long route. My phone stayed on the kitchen counter most of the weekend. 3 more voicemails from Warren. One from a former colleague named Denise in finance who wanted to know if I was okay. Nothing from Diane. Monday morning, I woke up at 7:30 for the first time in over a decade without an alarm. I made coffee, I read the newspaper the way my father used to, and I sat at the kitchen table thinking about what came next. I was not in a rush. That was the strange part. For 11 years, my Monday mornings had started at 6:15 a.m. with a synchronized operations call across 4 regional hubs. Now the only thing on my schedule was a dentist appointment Corinne had made for me 2 months earlier that I had almost forgotten about. At 10:47 a.m., my phone rang again. This time it was Eleanor Voss. Marcus, she said, do you have 20 minutes? I told her I did. She got straight to the point. Halston-Krager's executive leadership team had held an emergency internal meeting Friday afternoon after her call with me. They had reviewed the situation over the weekend. On Monday morning at 9:00 a.m. Cleveland time, they had convened a formal decision meeting about the Meridian relationship. The conclusion of that meeting had been reached less than an hour before she called me. Halston-Krager was going to terminate their contract with Meridian Freight Partners, effective at the end of the current billing cycle, 30 days out. They would not be renewing. I sat down at the kitchen table when she said it, not because I was surprised, because I understood immediately what it meant. Eleanor kept talking. She explained that the decision was not personal to me. It was structural. Halston-Krager had specific operational requirements that had been engineered into their supply chain over the past 3 years. Those requirements were tied to institutional knowledge that no longer existed inside Meridian's leadership structure. Continuing the relationship without that knowledge represented an unacceptable operational risk to their manufacturing timelines. She was telling me all of this, she said, because she wanted me to hear it from her before I heard about it through the industry. Then she paused, and she said the sentence that changed the second half of my life. Marcus, she said, Our board has authorized me to make you an offer. We would like you to come to Halston Krager as our new Vice President of Supply Chain Operations, reporting directly to me. The compensation package is roughly triple what you were making at Meridian. We would like an answer by the end of the week. I did not respond immediately. I did not respond at all for maybe 15 seconds. Alina waited. She was good at waiting. Finally, I said, Alina, I need to think about it. I need to talk to my wife. She said, of course. She said she expected nothing less. She said, take the week. She said she hoped I would say yes. We ended the call at 11:09 a.m. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time. Karen came into the kitchen around noon and asked me what I wanted for lunch. I looked up at her and I said, Karen, sit down. I need to tell you something. Meanwhile, at 2:47 p.m. that same afternoon, in a conference room 3 states away, Warren Blackwell was being informed that his largest client had just terminated their contract. He would call me for the 4th time that evening. I would let it go to voicemail again. Karen sat across from me at the kitchen table while I told her everything. The call from Alina, the offer, the number, the timeline. She listened without interrupting the way she always did when something serious was being decided. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked me one question. Marcus, she said, is this what you actually want, or is this you saying yes because it's the opposite of what happened last Wednesday? That question stopped me. Because she was right to ask it. There is a specific type of decision people make right after they have been humiliated, and it usually looks like the right decision on the surface, but underneath it is really just revenge dressed up in a suit. I did not want to make that mistake. I told Karen I needed to think about it for a few days before answering. She agreed. She said she would support whatever I decided. That night I could not sleep. Not because I was anxious, but because for the first time in 11 years I was actually thinking about my career instead of just executing it. I got out of bed around 2:15 a.m., went downstairs, and sat in the living room in the dark. I thought about what the job at Halston Krager would actually look like day to day. I thought about Alina's leadership style, which I respected. I thought about the operational challenges their supply chain was facing, most of which I already understood because I had been managing them from the outside for years. And I thought about something else too. I thought about the fact that at 51 years old, I might have exactly one more meaningful career move left in me before retirement, and I needed to make sure it was the right one. Tuesday morning, I made 2 phone calls. The first was to a former mentor of mine named Harold Kettering, a retired logistics executive who had run the largest freight brokerage in the region back in the 1990s and 2000s. Harold was 78 years old and lived on a lake in northern Michigan. I told him the situation. He listened carefully. Then he said something that stayed with me. Marcus, he said, in my 40 years in this industry, I watched a lot of good operators get pushed out by executives who did not understand what they were pushing out until it was too late. The ones who did best afterward were the ones who did not chase the paycheck. They chased the work. If Halston Krager is offering you the work you actually want to do, take it. If they are just offering you a bigger number, walk away. The second call was to a corporate attorney named Rebecca Winslow, who I had known for about 6 years. I asked her to review the offer letter Alina had emailed me Monday afternoon. She told me she would have feedback by Wednesday morning. Meanwhile, back at Meridian, the internal situation was collapsing faster than anyone there had anticipated. I know this because Denise from finance called me Tuesday afternoon and told me. She was not gossiping. She was warning me. She said Warren had convened an emergency executive meeting Monday evening after the Halston Krager termination notice had been received. Diane had tried to frame the loss as unrelated to my departure. Warren had not been convinced. 2 board members had called Warren directly on Tuesday morning demanding an explanation. The largest one, a man named Gerald Hofstetter who owned nearly 18% of the company, had reportedly asked Warren one direct question. Whose decision was it to publicly demean the vice president of operations 6 days before we lost our largest client? Denise did not know how Warren had answered. She said the meeting had ended without a clear resolution. She said the operations floor was in complete disarray because nobody knew who was making decisions about active shipments. She said 3 of my direct reports had already called recruiters. Then she said something quieter. "Marcus," she said, "I think Diane is going to be gone by the end of the month." Wednesday morning arrived exactly 1 week after Diane Prescott had called me replaceable in the glass boardroom on the 14th floor. 7 days. I remember thinking about that as I drank my coffee. 7 days earlier, I had been sitting in a leather chair in an executive meeting watching my career get reduced to a throwaway sentence. Now, 7 days later, I was sitting at my kitchen table in a flannel shirt, reading through a contract offer that would triple my compensation and place me on the executive committee of the very company that had just terminated Meridian's largest account. Rebecca Winslow called me at 9:30 a.m. with her legal review. The contract was clean. There were 2 minor provisions she wanted adjusted before signing, both of them standard executive negotiation items regarding severance protection and non-compete geographic scope. She said Halston Krager's legal team had drafted the offer in good faith. There were no hidden traps. If I wanted the job, she said, the paperwork was straightforward. I thanked her and told her I would get back to her by Friday. Then, at 11:47 a.m., Warren Blackwell called me for the 6th time in 5 days. I do not know why I answered that particular call. Maybe because I had made my peace with the situation over the weekend. Maybe because I was curious what he would say now that Halston Krager had officially terminated. Maybe because part of me wanted to hear his voice one more time before I closed that chapter of my life permanently. I picked up on the 3rd ring. "Marcus," he said, "thank you for taking my call." His voice was different than it had been on Thursday morning in my office. Thinner, more careful. The kind of voice executives use when they know the person on the other end of the phone has all the leverage and they are trying to figure out how much of it will be used against them. I did not say anything. I let him talk. He told me the situation at Meridian had become untenable. He told me the board had lost confidence in Diane's judgment. He told me he was prepared to make significant changes to the executive leadership structure. He told me he wanted me to consider coming back, not to my old role, but to a newly created position of Chief Operating Officer, with equity, board observer rights, and full authority over both operations and the financial planning associated with operations. He told me the compensation would be substantially higher than my previous package. He did not mention Halston Krager by name. He did not need to. Both of us knew exactly what conversation we were really having. I let him finish. Then I said, "Warren, I appreciate the offer. I am going to decline." There was a long silence on the other end. He asked me if there was anything he could do to change my mind. I told him no. He asked me if it was a matter of compensation. I told him it was not. He asked me if there was any circumstance under which I would reconsider. I paused before I answered that one. Then I said, "Warren, last Wednesday, when Diane said what she said in that boardroom, you had a choice. You could have corrected her in the moment. You could have called me into your office afterward and made it right. You could have done any number of things that would have told me my 11 years at this company actually meant something to you. You did none of those things. And now, 6 days after we lost Halston Krager, you are calling me because you need the operational knowledge I built to save the company. That is not a reason for me to come back. That is the reason I am not coming back." He did not respond for a long time. Then he said, "I understand. I wish you well, Marcus." The call ended at 12:04 p.m. I never spoke to Warren Blackwell again. I called Eleanor Voss that afternoon at 3:15 p.m. and I accepted the offer. She did not sound surprised. She sounded pleased in a controlled, professional way. She told me their internal HR team would be in touch by end of day Thursday with onboarding logistics. She told me they wanted me to start in 3 weeks, which would give me time to handle personal matters and take a short break before beginning. She told me one more thing before we ended the call. She said, "Marcus, I want you to know that the offer we made you was not opportunistic. This is a role we have needed to fill for 18 months. We were waiting for the right person. When you became available last week, the decision was easy. I thanked her. I meant it. That evening, Corinne and I went out to dinner at a small Italian place 2 blocks from our house. We had been going there for almost 12 years. The owner, a woman named Rosa, always recognized us. She did not know anything about what had happened over the past week, and I did not tell her. We ordered the same things we always ordered. We talked about small things. Corinne's sister was thinking about visiting from Denver in December. Our neighbor's dog had gotten into our backyard again. The furnace was going to need to be serviced before winter. Ordinary things. The kind of conversation people have when the big decisions are already behind them. At one point during dinner, Corinne looked at me across the table and she said, "Marcus, I want to tell you something. When you came home last Wednesday and you were quiet for 2 hours in the kitchen, I thought something was really wrong. Not because of what happened at work, because I could see you deciding something. And I was worried you were going to spend the next year of your life angry. I am really glad you didn't." I told her I was glad too. I told her something else. I told her that the version of me that would have spent a year being angry was a version of me that would have belonged to Meridian even after I left. And I did not want to belong to that place anymore. Not in any way. Not even in my resentment. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. The next few weeks were quieter than any period of my adult life. I did not check the industry news. I did not answer calls from recruiters, and there were a lot of them. Word travels fast in freight logistics. By the end of the second week, at least 4 competing firms had reached out through various channels trying to gauge my interest. I told all of them the same thing through a polite email response. "Thank you for reaching out. My next role has been decided. I wish you continued success." I did hear things anyway, whether I wanted to or not. Denise from finance kept me updated with occasional texts. Diane Prescott had been asked to resign on the Friday morning following my conversation with Warren. The official statement to employees called it a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities. Nobody believed that language, but nobody said so out loud. 2 other executives had left within the following week, both of them citing personal reasons. Warren himself remained CEO, but Denise said the board had brought in an outside consulting firm to conduct a full leadership assessment. Denise did not think Warren would still be CEO by spring. Meridian did not collapse. I want to be clear about that. Companies rarely collapse in one dramatic moment. What happened to Meridian was slower and quieter. They lost 2 more mid-tier clients within the following 90 days. Their revenue projections were revised downward twice before the end of the fiscal year. Their stock, which had been trading around $42 the week I left, dropped to $28 by February. None of that gave me satisfaction. It just felt like watching weather. I started at Halston Krager Industrial on the second Monday of November. The corporate campus sat on a 200-acre property just outside Cleveland, and my new office was on the 4th floor of the main administrative building, with a window that looked out over a small man-made lake the founders had put in back in the 1960s. It was the kind of view that reminded you the company had been around a long time and planned to be around a lot longer. My office was smaller than the one I had at Meridian, which surprised me. I mentioned it to Alina on my first day. She laughed and said, "Marcus, at Halston Krager, we do not measure importance by square footage. We measure it by the meetings you get invited to. You will be in every meeting that matters." She was right. The first 90 days were the most demanding stretch of work I had done in 15 years. Halston Krager's supply chain was significantly larger than anything I had managed at Meridian. 12 manufacturing facilities across 4 states. 3 international sourcing corridors. A logistics network that touched 16 countries. The scale was different, but the underlying problems were familiar. Broken handoffs between departments. Institutional knowledge trapped in the heads of people who were 3 years from retirement. Vendor relationships that had drifted because nobody had actively managed them in years. I did not try to change everything at once. That is the mistake most executives make when they walk into a new role at a new company. They try to prove their value by rearranging things in the first 30 days, and they end up breaking systems they did not fully understand yet. I spent my first month mostly listening. I sat in on operations calls at every facility. I flew out to visit the 4 largest plants personally. I met with 63 employees one-on-one at every level from senior director down to warehouse floor lead. I asked them the same 3 questions every time. What is working? What is broken? What would you fix if you had the authority? Alina watched me do this without commenting. Then, at the end of my first month, she called me into her office and she said, "Marcus, I want you to know something. In the 22 years I have been at this company, I have watched 4 vice presidents come into this role. You are the first one who spent the first month listening instead of talking. That tells me we made the right decision." The Halston-Krager board formally approved my strategic operational plan in the second week of February. It was the largest supply chain restructuring the company had undertaken in 11 years. The board vote was unanimous. Alina sent me an email that evening that said one sentence, "Welcome to the executive committee," meaning it in a way that went beyond my title. By March, I was traveling almost every week. Cleveland to Atlanta, Atlanta to Chicago, Chicago to Dallas, Dallas to Phoenix. I did not mind the travel. Corinne came with me on some of the trips when she could, and we made a point of extending the trips into small vacations whenever possible. We spent a weekend in Sedona in early April that I still remember as one of the best weekends of our marriage. She said something to me over dinner that night that I have not forgotten. She said, "Marcus, you are a different person than you were a year ago." And I do not mean that in a bad way. I mean that in the way people are different after they finally stop trying to prove something to people who were never going to see them clearly. I thought about that for a long time afterward. She was right. Something had shifted in me during that quiet weekend at the kitchen table almost 6 months earlier, and I had been living in the aftermath of that shift ever since. Not angrily, not vengefully, just clearly. The call from Diane Prescott came in late April. I had not thought about her in months. I mean that literally. I had spent so much of my mental energy on the work at Halston-Krager that the entire Meridian chapter had receded into something that felt more like a story from someone else's life than a memory from my own. When my phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon and I saw the name Diane Prescott on the screen, it took me a full 3 seconds to remember who she was. I was in my office in Cleveland. I had just finished a meeting with our sourcing director about a supplier issue in Vietnam. My assistant had stepped out for lunch. The building was quiet in the way corporate buildings get quiet around 1:30 in the afternoon. I looked at the phone. I let it ring 4 times. Then I let it go to voicemail. She left a message. I did not listen to it right away. I finished a document I had been drafting. I responded to 2 emails. I refilled my water glass. Then around 2:15, I closed my office door, sat down at my desk and listened. Her voice was different than the last time I had heard it, softer, more measured. She said her name at the beginning, which surprised me. She said, "Marcus, this is Diane Prescott." She said she knew this call was probably unwelcome. She said she was reaching out because she had spent the last several months thinking about what had happened between us, and she wanted the chance to speak with me directly. She said she was no longer at Meridian. She said she had taken some time off to reflect. She said she was starting a new consulting practice, and she was reaching out to people from her career whom she felt she owed an honest conversation. She said if I was willing, she would appreciate the opportunity to talk. She left a callback number. She thanked me for listening to the message. Then she said one more sentence before she ended the voicemail. She said, "Marcus, for what it's worth, I was wrong." I sat at my desk for a long time after the voicemail ended. I want to be clear about what I felt in that moment because I think it matters. I did not feel vindicated. I did not feel triumphant. I did not feel any of the emotions people in my situation are supposed to feel when the person who wronged them finally admits they were wrong. What I felt was quieter than any of that. I felt tired. Not tired in a physical way. Tired in the way a person feels when a chapter they thought was closed suddenly opens back up and asks them to sit with it a little longer. I thought about calling her back that afternoon. I did not. I thought about calling her back the next day. I did not. I actually never called her back. Not because I was holding onto anger. I was not. I had let go of the anger months earlier during that weekend at the kitchen table. I did not call her back because I realized, sitting in my office in Cleveland that Tuesday afternoon, that I did not owe Diane Prescott the conversation she was asking for. Her decision to say those two words in that boardroom on that Wednesday afternoon had cost her a job, cost her a career, and cost her most of her professional reputation in an industry where reputation is the only currency that lasts. That was not my problem to help her process. I deleted the voicemail that Friday. I did not save the callback number. If I saw her name in an industry newsletter, I would nod once and move on. That was the extent of the closure I was willing to offer. Corinne asked me about it that night. I told her the truth. I told her I felt nothing. She said that was probably the healthiest thing I could have said. A year passed, then another 6 months. It is late October now, almost 18 months to the day since I sat in that glass boardroom on the 14th floor of Meridian Freight Partners and listened to Diane Prescott call me replaceable. I am writing this from my office at Houston Krager. It is raining outside. The small lake beyond my window has that gray-green color it gets in the fall, and the trees on the far shore are just starting to turn. In a few weeks, everything out there will be bare, and then in a few more weeks, everything will be white. I have watched 2 full cycles of that lake now. I know what the seasons look like from this window in a way I never knew what they looked like from the window at Meridian. Houston Krager completed the operational restructuring I designed a little over 4 months ago. The results have been better than the board projected. Our on-time delivery metrics improved by 14% in the first 2 quarters after implementation. Our vendor cost variance dropped by nearly 22%. 2 of our largest manufacturing clients renewed their multi-year supply agreements with expanded terms. Alina Voss was promoted to Chief Operating Officer in July. I was promoted to Executive Vice President of Global Supply Chain in the same announcement. My compensation package now includes equity that vests over 5 years. Corinne and I bought a small vacation property in northern Michigan 2 months ago, not far from where Harold Kettering used to live before he passed away last spring. Meridian Freight Partners still exists. That is the honest answer people always want when they ask me. The company did not go bankrupt. It did not disappear. It got smaller. It lost approximately 40% of its enterprise revenue over the 18 months following my departure. Warren Blackwell was replaced as CEO in March by an outside executive brought in by the board. The new CEO has spent most of his first 6 months trying to stabilize the remaining client relationships and rebuild the operational function from what was left. I hear he is a decent man. I have never met him. I have no opinion about whether he will succeed. Diane Prescott, I later learned, never did start that consulting practice she mentioned in the voicemail. Someone told me she took a mid-level finance role at a private company in a different industry about a year after leaving Meridian. That is all I know. That is all I need to know. People ask me sometimes, when the story comes up at industry events or over dinner with new colleagues, whether I feel like I won. That question always makes me uncomfortable because it assumes the situation was a competition. It was not. What happened between Diane and me and Meridian and Houston Krager was not a battle with winners and losers. It was a series of consequences following a series of choices. She made a choice in that boardroom. I made a choice at my kitchen table that night. Alina made a choice the following Monday morning. Warren made a choice by not answering the question I never asked him. Every one of those choices led exactly where it was going to lead. If there is anything I have learned from all of it, it is this. Loyalty is not a bank you deposit into for decades hoping the interest will save you in a crisis. Loyalty is a daily choice between 2 parties, and the moment one party stops making that choice, the other party is free. That freedom is not revenge. It is not bitterness. It is not even satisfaction. It is just the quiet return of a person to themselves. Diane Prescott said 2 words in a glass boardroom on a Wednesday afternoon. 6 days later, her company lost its largest client. 18 months later, I am writing this from a window overlooking a lake I have come to love. Those two facts are related. They are also, in the end, the least important part of the story. Thank you for watching. If this story resonated with you, please like the video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe for more stories about the quiet moments when a career, and sometimes a life, finally turns in the right direction. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you walked away from something that no longer deserved you. I read everyone.